All right, picture this. It's the stroke of midnight, August 1947. British colonial rule in South Asia is officially over, and two brand new, independent nations are born side by side. Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving headfirst into one of the most fascinating and, frankly, most profound puzzles in all of comparative politics. Why exactly did Pakistan develop into a heavily militarized state while its immediate neighbor, India, just didn't? If you're studying state building, this divergence is absolutely essential to understand. We're going to break down a major academic debate today, looking at two radically different frameworks for why Pakistan's military has kept such an iron grip on the country.
Okay, let's take a quick look at the agenda. We'll be contrasting TVPol's historical warrior state thesis with Aqil Shah's modern tutelary institutionalization framework, breaking down the puzzle, the economics, the recent constitutional changes, and finally putting these two scholars head-to-head.
So, let's set the stage with the fundamental question. Section 1, the divergence puzzle. To really wrap our heads around the scale of this puzzle, we have to look closely at that shared 1947 starting line. Because, on paper, both Pakistan and India emerged from British rule with incredibly similar advantages. I mean, they inherited the exact same British-Indian military structure, the same civil service bureaucracy, similar borders, and practically the same economic hurdles. But then, their paths just completely diverged. India managed to democratize and successfully put its military under strict civilian control. Pakistan, on the flip side, turned into a heavily militarized state that has repeatedly struggled with instability. And here's the real kicker. While a lot of other military-ruled countries in Asia and Latin America eventually democratized or became these prosperous developmental states, Pakistan has just remained stubbornly trapped in the cycle of military dominance. So what exactly sets Pakistan apart?
Now, in political science, there's this incredibly famous concept drawn from European history by the sociologist Charles Tilly. He basically said, war made the state and the state made war. In the European historical experience, the constant existential threat of war literally forced leaders to build strong centralized bureaucracies, right? They had to efficiently collect taxes and unify their populations just to survive. War preparation actually created state cohesion. But Pakistan? Pakistan represents this deeply paradoxical outcome that completely turns Tilly's theory on its head. Decades of intense, laser focus on war preparation hasn't unified the country at all. Instead, this militarization has just drained vital economic resources, fueled internal divisions, and left the state completely fractured. Why did war-making build Europe, but totally hollow out Pakistan?
To answer that, we begin with our first framework. Section 2, Paul's warrior state thesis.
To understand scholar TVPol's argument, we need to unpack two specialist terms, warrior state and hyper-realpolitik. A warrior state is essentially a nation that is utterly obsessed with danger. Its specialists in violence, namely the military, become the undisputed powerhouse of society, completely overshadowing any civilian leaders. But what's actually driving them? According to Paul, it's an ideology of hyper-realpolitik. This is a deeply Hobbesian worldview. It assumes international relations is nothing but a ruthless, zero-sum struggle for survival. Because Pakistan's elites perceive this massive existential threat from India, literally from day one, they adopted this framework. They prioritize narrow military security and hard power above absolutely everything else, completely bypassing pragmatic stuff like economic welfare, public health, or education.
So the crucial takeaway here is that Pakistan's elites haven't just been stumbling blindly through history. They've been operating on very specific ingrained codes since 1947. First up is this profound psychological obsession with achieving strategic parity with India. The military knew India was vastly larger in both population and economy, but they demanded equality at all costs. Because they viewed the world through that zero-sum lens, they took the next step, actively politicizing religion. They utilized Islam not just as personal faith, but as a deliberate political tool to unify a diverse country and motivate a super-aggressive military-first agenda. And when they realized conventional parity against a giant neighbor was basically impossible, these operational codes justified a really dangerous reliance on asymmetric warfare, meaning funding and using violent non-state actors in places like Kashmir and Afghanistan to project power they just couldn't afford conventionally.
This quote right here from TVPol hits the nail on the head. He says, the combination of ideas and circumstances, motive and opportunity, tells us why a country would pursue a warrior state strategy. This brilliantly captures his core thesis. This whole military-first setup wasn't some historical accident. It was a choice. The hyper-realpolitik ideas provided the motive, and the geopolitical environment provided the opportunity. They actively constructed a national identity around these concepts to ensure their own permanent dominance.
But here's the thing.
Ideas don't pay the bills. Let's look at how they afforded this. Section 3. The geostrategic curse. Paul introduces this concept called the geostrategic curse, and it is absolutely vital for understanding Pakistan's economy. Think of it kind of like the resource curse you see in oil-rich nations. But instead of oil, Pakistan's resource is its geography. Because it sits right at the crossroads of South and Central Asia, it has consistently been incredibly useful to global superpowers. During the Cold War, it was an essential anti-Soviet bulwark. During the War on Terror, it was a vital logistical hub for the US. So Pakistan's elites basically realized, hey, we don't actually need to do the hard work of building a strong domestic economy. They could just rent out their geopolitical location to superpowers in exchange for massive amounts of cash, foreign aid, and advanced weaponry.
Just take a look at this table. The contrast is staggering. On the left, the internal revenue failures are massive. Less than 2% of the population actually pays income tax. Wealthy elites dodge land reform entirely to protect their wealth. In any normal state, this level of internal dysfunction would lead to total bankruptcy. But look at the right side. It's entirely offset by external rent-seeking. Between 1960 and 2012 alone, they received over $73 billion in foreign aid. The US and China pump in immense funding, and whenever the economy gets close to the edge, the IMF or World Bank steps in with a bailout. This external life support means the wealthy elite literally never have to implement reforms or tax themselves, which completely severs the normal social contract between a state and its citizens.
All right, let's pivot to our second scholar, Aqil Shah, who brings a very different perspective. Section 4. Shah's New Tutelage Thesis.
Writing in the Journal of Democracy, Aqil Shah shifts our focus entirely away from historical ideology. He points us straight at aggressive, real-time constitutional engineering. While Paul is looking at a trajectory spanning decades, Shah argues that focusing too much on history actually blinds us to a highly specific, very modern transformation in how the military exercises its power today.
We have to differentiate between two concepts Shah brings up: contingent tutelage and tutelary institutionalization. For decades, Pakistan existed under contingent tutelage. Basically, think of the military as an informal referee. They were the guardian, occasionally stepping onto the field to fire a prime minister or stage a coup when they felt threatened. But their power was informal and episodic. What Shah argues is happening right now, post-2018, is tutelary institutionalization. The referee isn't just stepping onto the field anymore. They are permanently rewriting the rulebook. The military is abandoning arbitrary intervention and formally, legally, writing their absolute power directly into the laws and the Constitution. To really grasp how this happened, we need to look at this dramatic timeline from 2022 to 2025. It started with a political earthquake in April 2022 when Prime Minister Imran Khan was ousted. He fought back hard, leading to massive riots by his PTI party in May 2023. Now, normally, we'd expect a military coup here, but the military responded with a calculated, legalistic crackdown instead. They heavily manipulated the February 2024 elections to keep Khan's party out of power. Then, they used a brief crisis with India in May 2025 as the perfect excuse to push through the 27th Amendment later that year, which permanently and legally altered the balance of power.
How exactly did they pull off this new authoritarianism? Section 5. Tutelary institutionalization.
Shah lays out 4 very deliberate mechanisms the military used to replace arbitrary intervention with strict, rule-bound legalism. Step 1. Selective coercion. They crushed the PTI opposition using mass detentions in military tribunals. Step 2. Electoral manipulation. They carefully managed the 2024 vote to ensure only highly compliant, pliable civilian politicians took office. Step 3, and this is the absolute linchpin, judicial restructuring. Historically, the Supreme Court was the one body that occasionally pushed back. Well, the 27th Amendment legally stripped the judiciary of that independence, totally neutralizing that final check on their power. And finally, command consolidation. General Asim Munir was elevated to Field Marshal, an unprecedented move granting the Army Chief absolute, legally immune command over the entire armed forces and nuclear arsenal.
And here is the chilling brilliance of this whole strategy. As Shah points out, the military simply doesn't need to launch coups anymore, because their absolute power is now perfectly, structurally legal. By using compliant politicians to alter the Constitution, they've designed a system with a nice veneer of democracy. Sure, elections still happen, but they only serve to delegate basic, day-to-day administrative duties to civilians. True sovereign authority rests permanently, and legally, with the military high command.
Which brings us to the heart of our explainer. Section 6. The core academic disagreement.
So here's where the rubber meets the road. We have a deep fundamental academic disagreement over how to categorize this state.
TB Paul sees a decades-long historical pathology. For him, everything happening today is just the inevitable result of Pakistan's founding operational codes, the obsession with India, the geostrategic curse of living off foreign money, and using religion to justify military dominance. Aqil Shah, on the other hand, argues that getting bogged down in that history blinds us to the terrifying new reality. To Shah, the post-2018 era is a completely new regime type, a perfectly engineered, legally bulletproof autocracy built right now through modern institutional capture.
So why does this debate matter to us? Well, Pakistan is a nuclear-armed state of over 230 million people, sitting at one of the most critical geopolitical intersections on Earth. Understanding its trajectory is absolutely vital for global security. So, as university students analyzing comparative politics, I'm going to leave you with this to chew on. Which framework do you think better explains the Pakistan of today? Is it the heavy, inescapable weight of historical hyper-real politic and rent-seeking? Or are we witnessing a masterclass in modern, rule-bound authoritarian engineering? Truly understanding this divergence puzzle means wrestling with both of these perspectives without rushing to a simple, easy resolution. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning the structures of power.